Hello there and welcome to the May MCS 2019 pre-scene analysis videos, where we're going to cover the entire pre-scene document in all its glory to go through what we can understand and predict for the exam, ultimately to prepare you as best as possible to ace it. My name is Joseph and I am the MCS expert at Astranti. I write mocks for the MCS, as well as offering, tutor responses to any MCS queries as well as F3 queries, and I also write portions of our study text in regards to the MCS and F3. So that is my sort of background. I've been, working with the MCS for around 2.5 years now. It's quite a few sittings so far. And I've had a lot of sort of knowledge around this kind of level for a number of years now before I took over as the MCS expert at Astranti. So you can find sort of sneak previews and video clips surrounding the MCS and exam success in the case study at my Facebook page, which is sort of shown at the bottom. If you search that, you will find, all kinds of clips on a weekly basis regarding the MCS, even when there isn't a pre-scene around yet. We look at some examiners' reports. Okay, so besides that, what actually is the pre-scene? Well, it's a video series first and foremost in this analysis. We go section by section, covering each page in as much detail as you'll ever be required to do. It's very speculation based, but ultimately we're using our P2 and E2 theory in sort of the page, like the wordy sections of the pre-scene to pull out all the relevant points, as well as, applying F2 to our numerical information in the financial section. So the key points, industry guidance and how that relates to the company, and also we apply the business models. This is done mostly in the strategic analysis, but there will be mention in each section when it's particularly relevant. We talk about extensively the likely exam issues based on applying all this theory as we go through. So there will be hints to you and sort of key focus points for you to pick up on as we go through. There's also, these sort of standout exam hints and tips that we do come across. Like there are some that we're speculating on, and there are others that are just huge indicators that I will 100% point out to you, sort of the given questions that will definitely turn up in one of the variants. And potentially that variant is yours. We then have the strategic analysis, which is a very focused business model to pre-scene sort of video and presentation. And we have the top 10 most likely issues, which follows up all this information with essentially the top 10 problems that are likely to come up in the exam, with the top 1 to 4 being almost a guarantee that they will be, definitely there. We have a pretty good success rate. I believe in the past 5 sittings we have scored about 7.5 correct issues in the majority of the different variants. So with that in mind, you can have a lot of confidence in our sort of guesswork and speculation. And then there's the other ones near the top of that list, which are basically guaranteed to come up. So how is it going to work? We'll go section by section. We'll assume that there's no knowledge as I progress. So by that I mean you haven't pre-read the pre-scene. We'll be going through together as it was our first reading. If you've already read it, great. But I will assume that you have not read further on at any given point. The only thing I will assume is that you're relatively well versed in our F2, P2 and E2 modules, at least enough to be able to go back and revise a topic if, we mention that it's particularly relevant. What I suggest throughout this series is that you read a section and make notes just before, you watch it, or just after you watch the section. And this will mean that you can compare and contrast with my speculations and sort of inputs, and this will give you the biggest and most well-rounded exam prep you can possibly get. So very much go with that. It's very, very useful. And as we go through, of course, I'll have my review. At each video end, I will sort of sum up to the best of my ability what we've covered and why it's important. And of course, the last two products, we'll be going through a full strategic analysis and the top 10 issues, which are pretty straightforward as we discussed in the previous slide. So, without further ado, you will now cut to the current MCS pre-scene for you to get stuck in with. So, just to clarify how these series is going to go, the first video we're going to cover the intro page through to the house building in Corvola. So we're going to do 4 to 5 pages per video. So for example, video 2 is going to finish between house building in Corvola through to one-stop shop approach diagram, and video 3 will pick up from one-stop shop diagram through to Jord organization structure, and then we're going to have the annual reports, the articles, all covered in different videos. The only key thing to remember here is that we always put the financials in video 6. So with that in mind, we will have to break chronology between 5 and 6. 5 will cover the risks and exhibits most likely, whereas video 6 will be where we look at all the financial statements. So with that said, let's crack on with the first intro page. Now, we typically say that the pre-scene is the context for the unseen exam, but this page, small as it is actually the context for the entire pre-scene, and we can get so much from it, despite the fact that many people will read this and rush through it because it's small and it's introductory. This is actually vital. So let's get stuck in. The first thing I want to mention is that we are, of course, a finance manager, and we're working for a company called Jord Homes, or Jord, and they manufacture and assemble high-quality prefabricated houses. Let's break that down. Manufacture and assemble. The first thing we need to think about here is health and safety. We have two very important processes here, and we're handling something to do with houses. We're building houses, so large materials, heavy materials, large machinery. So we have to have our health and safety aspects as a concern straight away. Also, we have the supply chain to think about. If we're manufacturing, it means we're interacting with suppliers. So that's typically going to be outsourced delivery from the supplier to us. The suppliers often handle this. And we're also assembling the houses themselves on a construction site. So we perhaps are outsourcing that transport from the factory to the construction site. And that again is where the supply chain can have some issues. So straight away, we've got an issue or some potential aspects to derive from manufacturing and assembling. And on top of this, we have that high quality adjective here for prefabricated houses. So first, we're going to learn more about prefabs in the next few pages from what I saw on the contents page, but short and sweet, they are homes built in factories and then taken to the site and built there, often in room form, modules, or in panel form, which is like having all the walls made and then stuck together like a Lego piece on the construction site. So most of the production happens in a factory. But importantly, high quality. So if we think about Porter's generic strategies, we're looking for a differentiation focus. We're looking for a more luxury branding here. We're not sure quite how far on that spectrum we go. However, we are going to be a more premier brand of these homes. We are then told that Jord is based in the prosperous and well-developed Central European country of Corvola. So this is also quite important. When you have premier branding and you're looking for that differentiation focus, you are going to need a fairly affluent consumer base. You need to have quite a lot of disposable income or ability to save a lot of money for their bespoke, fancy house that they're buying. So it being a prosperous location gives us the idea that we have an appropriate strategy for the consumer market in Corvola. So they match up very well. The next thing we see is that we report directly to Jord's finance director. This is actually a really, really important point which may go undetected usually. So, in most cases, we report to senior management, which then report to the finance director. And with this in mind, it means that we are going to be more involved with somebody who actually has massive input on the strategic aspects of the business. So whilst our role is going to be monitoring the implementation of the strategy, there will likely be some conversations with the finance director regarding a slightly more strategic approach. So this will, in the exam, translate to we're probably going to be required to make more suggestions. Now, the key thing with the MCS, if you've looked at the study text for the MCS, part of the syllabus presents that one of the skills they're looking for is, in terms of technical skills, providing relatively brief but appropriate suggestions where necessary, where it's like, appropriate to do so, thinking of sound ideas for the strategy where it's like, needed or applicable. So with that in mind, it's going to be a slightly different MCS compared to some you've seen before, perhaps in past papers, etc. This is going to be a little bit more on that suggestion focus, so keep that in mind as we move forward. So we work in a small finance team, and your primary responsibilities are associated with management accounting. That's straightforward. Again, monitoring the implementation of strategy. That's the very basis of management accounting at the manager's level. However, again, we have that suggestion is more likely to come up as part of the questions based on our interaction with the finance director. So please keep that in mind, because we do need to think slightly more strategically as we go through this pre-scene. Next, we see that this often requires you to liaise with colleagues from other functional areas, including production. So this is where our P2 knowledge is going to come in. JIT versus lean manufacturing, for example. How do we produce? Can we make it more efficient along the value chain? How does the supply chain work? What are the risks involved? Lots of P2 there. That's where we're going to get the bulk of our P2 questions, I imagine, based on the fact we're constructing stuff. And then also we've got sales, marketing, and human resources. The construction sector typically has a lot of subcontracted work, so not full-time employees. They're employed on a project-by-project basis, or perhaps they have a sort of semi-agreement where that team will work on X projects per year, per month, or to demand, etc. It's quite specific to the contract, but they have a lot of different workers, and those kinds of not full-time workers may have some issues, maybe will threaten industrial action or not working with us in the future. That's where your HR stuff will come in, negotiation skills, etc. Further to this, the finance director is responsible for reporting and strategic management, but delegates some responsibility to you. So again, this is linking back to the fact that we're in a rare situation where the management level is in direct contact with a finance director. That's not normal, but it's nothing to worry about. It just means that we're going to have a lot more of a strategic focus compared to usual. This translates to making a few suggestions in your answers on top of the normal management accounting monitoring of the strategy implementation. So let's make sure we have that very, very strongly in our minds. Now, the next sentence is really small, but people often overlook it. Corvola's currency is the C dollar. So this means that Corvola's not got a shared currency. For example, if we were to do some work in the Eurozone, so neighbouring European countries, they will likely have the euro. But Corvola does not have the euro despite being in Europe. So this means that if we're to operate in different regions or different legislatures, we are going to have the exchange rate risk of C dollars converting to euros or pounds or dollars, wherever we are in the world. So this is actually really important, despite being such a small, innocuous sentence. It's really important. Exchange rate risk. And typically, this is going to translate to, a lot of aspects that the business will go into, because construction usually goes beyond borders. Eventually, most companies expand to several different locations because you want to meet global demand for housing, which is very high. And finally, we're told that company law in Corvola requires that financial statements be prepared in accordance with IFRS. So this will be very familiar to you based on the F2 module. We won't have to do any calculations. That is never a requirement in the MCS exam or any other case study exams at present. However, many of you will have studied your F2 module before 2019. But 2019 brought a small update to the CIMA syllabus that is live now, currently, and essentially some of the IASs moved on to IFRS's new regulations. Now, the big one here that did change in F2 in particular is that regarding financial instruments, IFRS 9. And this may come into play. It probably won't, but I'm going to warn you and go through it now really quick, just to make sure that you are relatively comfortable with this change. So IFRS 9 changed the way in which you can account for different financial instruments. Typically, this is to do with mitigating exchange rate risk, which we do have. So exchange rate risk is typically reduced in risk by having different options and forward contracts that sort of preempt any changes in exchange rate. We do not need to know the exact workings of those instruments, but we do need to know that there are instruments that exist that we can undertake to mitigate exchange rate risk, such as a currency option. Don't worry about exactly how that works. Again, we don't need to do calcs. We just need to talk about what can work. But relating back to IFRS 9, those instruments have some changes, and one of the ways in which you can account for those instruments now with IFRS 9 is that they are amortized. So over a period of time, they're accounted each year. And there are three things that need to be present for an instrument, a financial instrument, to be amortized on the accounts. And I'll put that up on screen now, just and quickly go through it. There's no real depth needed here. I'm going to show you everything, but we just need to know the key features here, just in case it comes up. I doubt you'll need it. I do doubt you'll need it, but just in the sort of safety and assuring that you are as well prepared as possible, I'm going to pop it up now. So ultimately, only debt instruments such as bonds, debentures and commercial papers can be amortized. So in this case, you're looking at perhaps investing in different aspects of a company overseas, so it's denominated in that currency, which can, provide some protection against exchange rate risk, but ultimately this applies to all kinds of risk involving debt instruments and just how they're accounted for. So they have to be debt instruments. That's number one. Number two, you must intend to hold the asset with aim of collecting the cash flows it generates until the instrument matures. So, whilst that is the case, that it has to be a debt instrument, you also need to hold it without the intent to sell it on. You're looking just to hold it for the life cycle of that instrument. So if it's a 5-year bond, hold it for 5 years, get your principal and your interest, boom, done. That's the business model test. That's the thing we need to remember, this business model test. You don't need to go into too much specifics on the other stuff. On top of this, the agreement generates contractual cash flows that represent the only form of capital gains for the entity. So essentially, the contractual cash flow test, that's the thing we need to remember, means that only the principal, so the money in the bond, that's the value, the face value, and interest can be gained from the asset to be measured at amortized cost. So again, We will not need to explain this in all likelihood, and to be honest, I don't think this will come up, but I just want to make sure. So IFRS 9, 3 things to remember in regards to amortized costing: has to be a debt instrument, has to pass 2 tests, business model, contractual cash flow test, boom, done. That is everything you might need to know, but again, it's a strong maybe. You probably don't need it, but I just want to make sure you're as prepared as possible. Now, let's move on through to page 2. And here we can see a lot of background information on the industry. Again, we have done this in the industry pack. If you haven't seen it already, we're going to go through it, no worries. But it's very, very interesting actually. So house prefabrication is the practice of manufacturing and assembling the components of a house in a factory. So several things here. It's in a factory, so we probably have some high assets. We probably have a very large factory in which we build our homes. That's a nice big asset, and we'll see that on the financial statement. But also again, manufacturing and assembling the components of a house, health and safety. Really, really strong connotations there. So with that in mind, let's make another note just to keep it fresh in our minds, because it is probably going to be quite a key aspect as we move forward, because it's construction. Health and safety is hand in hand in regards to that. So that's regards to regulations and potential issues and risks that might arise. Worker motivation, happiness, industrial action, etc. Working conditions is one of the reasons for industrial action. For example, next up we see that transporting the sub-assemblies to the construction site where the house is located. So once again, we have that supply chain aspect. It's probably outsourced, but again, it's about ensuring that it doesn't go wrong. If you remember from the industry pack, which I'm sure we will get mention of further on, the speed of construction is faster. So it's a key benefit of prefabrication versus traditional building that it happens fast. Transport errors or issues will slow that down and reduce the appeal of a prefab house versus a traditional house. Next up, we see that the final assembly and completion of internal fittings are carried out on site. So again, this is where slightly more health and safety comes in, because when it's on site, that portion of production will be subject to weather conditions. So rain can cause slippy surfaces, make it more difficult to grip things, etc. You can think of a myriad of different issues that could arise. Again, health and safety, risk register, that kind of thing, making sure we're aware of the risks and ensuring we've sort of acted upon them, mitigating them. That kind of thing is very, very important here. We then get an explanation of what prefabricated means, and it's to distinguish this type of house building process from the more conventional house building process. Now, this is ultimately a definition, but it's something I want to pick up on very, very specifically. The conventional house building process is where all construction and internal work is carried out on site. That's what we have done for thousands of years, essentially. However, we have to keep in mind that prefabricated construction is a disruptive industry or sub-industry of the broader construction industry. It's changing the way that construction is done. It's disruptive. So with that in mind, we have a lot of semi-competitors. Traditional construction traditional construction companies may also be building houses, as you might expect. They will also want to compete for different contracts and for our customers as well. So whilst they may do it all on site, they may have lots of sustainable aspects that prefabs bring. Also, they may be trying to make more effort to use more technology, etc., just to compete. So we're not looking at just direct competition from other prefab construction companies, but also large traditional companies in construction. On top of this, large traditional companies, as we saw in the industry pack, are looking to move into prefabs. They may want to buy the expertise, so we need to be wary of being acquired by a huge traditional construction company, because that overall industry is worth trillions of dollars globally. So there's some very, very large companies out there that could potentially want to acquire Jord for their expertise. We don't know that yet. Again, it's all a big question mark at this point. However, I do want to point out it's very important to realize we are a disruptive alternative to traditional building. As we move along here, we can see that prefab houses sometimes, well, prefabricated houses are sometimes referred to as prefabs or modular homes. Modular is a style of the prefab process. For example, modular buildings will be built in different segments, so rooms usually, and then stacked on each other like Lego. There's also another process called panel prefab homes, where you're building the walls essentially instead of the actual rooms themselves, and then you are sort of putting them into place like a jigsaw. So very similar but different. You're producing different aspects and putting them together slightly differently. One from the industry pack, the panels have slightly more customizability, but modular is the simplest and most effective way to build homes. It's very, very popular at the moment. Lots of specialisms there across the industry. So they're manufactured in factories. Again, we've discussed this, but importantly, they use CAD and CAM software. So lots of precision, lots of technology. Two things here. Precision and technology reduces the health and safety risk to labor, because we essentially are using more technology and less people to do very important processes that often involve very, very large and dangerous machinery. So with that in mind, we are reducing the risks there. However, we have a counter risk, a sort of a subsequent risk of using lots of technology, because we're going to seek to improve our technology as much as possible. We are a luxury brand, so Jord are going to want to be on the cutting edge of technology to ensure that they can offer the best possible service at all times. But this has to be balanced with the fear of redundancies and sort of the employee aspects of that improvement, because more tech means less labor. And when you keep cutting labor costs rather, such as redundancies, you then spark fear in your retained labor. Now, those employees need to be motivated to work efficiently, such as with the learning curve. Learning curve states the more you do something that's repetitive, you will get better and more efficient at it, but it requires motivation, if you remember. So with that in mind, we need to balance the risks of employees becoming demotivated and the benefits of increasing the amount of technology in our process. As we move down then, we can also see that manufacturing of the house takes place in advance, usually in sub-assembled sections. That's like the modular aspect, and then shipped to fully assembled in the required location. So again, we have that supply chain aspect we need to be wary of, likely outsourced, but then that obviously brings some risks if there's ever an issue, because timing is imperative as a benefit over traditional construction, who we are also competing with alongside other prefab businesses. So as I mentioned, construction is normally much faster for prefab houses than traditionally built houses, and they are built in enclosed and controlled environments. So yes, no weather for the majority of the process. This means that rain doesn't slow things down, no storms, no extreme cold or heat causing expansion of materials, all that kind of stuff that throws things off or delays things slightly but consistently, which adds up obviously. You then have a faster build time. But this is going to be a key perk of prefab houses. So if we ever fail to keep that benefit or perk of having a prefab house, then we're going to lose customers to traditional builds or to other prefab providers that aren't having issues. So it's key as a critical success factor to ensure the supply chain works very, very efficiently and make sure there's no issues in quality, because we're a luxury brand, and time, because it's a key benefit of prefab homes. We can see that a prefab house usually employs less labor to complete its construction, since most of the basic construction is done in a factory using CAD and CAM. So again, links back to this balancing act that we do need to undertake. We can't have staff becoming demotivated. It will reduce any sort of efficiencies gained in tech. It will then have an adverse effect in the labour aspects. So probably the actual on-site construction, for example. All those aspects will have to be balanced. We need to make sure that we're keeping on the cutting edge without making too many staff redundant, which will then have some negative effects on existing staff. So with that in mind, we can now move on to the next page. But I do want to highlight, just before we move on, that it's very, very important that we remember about us being a sub-industry. We are disrupting the main industry of construction, challenging the way they build things. So our critical success factors are imperative and intrinsically linked to all the benefits of prefab housing. If we ever fail on that as a business, as Jord, then we're losing customers not only to competitors that are prefab builders, but also traditional builders. So now we're going to look at the prefab housing industry and how it became to be. And again, we have covered this in the industry pack. If you've already seen that, you will have a leg up as we go through. But there are some interesting sort of points that are made that we have seen before, of course. The housing industry begins rather in the 20th century. And this is because essentially of the World War in 1940s. In the post-war period, due to all the destruction in the immediate aftermath, Europe especially needed a lot of quick housing because lots of people didn't have a home anymore due to all the damage. So what they did was they decided to build homes in factories. The government thought they would last 5 to 10 years whilst they got their sort of things sorted out to make sure all the infrastructure was repaired fully. And to their surprise, some of these houses have lasted all the way up to the early 2000s and were actually quite popular with residents that lived there. There were whole estates full of them. So, whilst there isn't too much to say in direct link to an exam question, it's important to note that the technological developments are what drove this, alongside the surprise factor of them lasting so long and people actually liking them. So regulations then changed because they seemed as quite a viable option for solving housing issues. But then you have housing issues because of growing populations. And then as we become more aware of the environment, that population growth is also aware of the possibility of sustainable housing. Or sustainable housing rather. They don't want the environment to suffer as part of their housing process and also the running of their house. So these are the key growth drivers, and linking back to that reminder I just said about us being a disruptive industry competing with traditional builders as well, we really need to nail these aspects, especially in regards to sustainability and technology. Those things are key growth drivers and both fit the sort of luxury branding. They're both things that we can push to an extreme as part of Jord Homes' sort of luxury differentiation. So if we ever fail on this, we start losing business to traditional builders and other prefab companies as well. So again, if you recall that we're directly linked to the finance director, we will have to keep this in mind because it is a key strategic point. Next up, we see that prefab houses are increasingly being considered as high quality, permanent dwellings for middle income individuals. So again, middle income individuals means that it's fitting our consumer base. Corvola is prosperous and well developed, so we're going to have a lot of these middle income individuals seeking a prefab home, and importantly it says in many parts of the world. This implies that Jord can expand. We don't know the exact locations of their business yet, but again there's room for expansion, and they develop this point regarding Asia and Latin America and have large growing population bases with rising disposable income, and this is a huge opportunity. Okay, so this is one of those moments where you sit down and you go, ooh, that sounds quite a lot like an exam question. Well, yes it is. That is an exam question waiting to be asked. And again, there are variants, so you won't all sit the same exam because they're called variants, of course, they change. However, some of you will sit this kind of question, about moving into Asia and Latin America. The fact they've mentioned Asia and Latin America specifically suggests that Jord probably aren't in these regions or are very minor sort of impact in those regions. So again, it's about expansion, an opportunity to expand, and this is going to bring about it lots of different aspects, such as how do we fund this project, how do we mitigate all the risks, pestle factors of moving into a different country, that is economics, exchange rate risk, for example, could be politics, the different issues, maybe some countries are doing well but have an unstable political environment, such as Brexit is an unstable political environment in theory. Also, we could consider the legal aspects, different regulations to follow, health and safety might be higher or lower. If we were to go to, say, Asia, where they might have lower regulations, how would our Western customers feel about us lowering our standards elsewhere? It's about branding as well. So pestle factors are a huge aspect here, and this is a very sort of well-packaged exam hint from the examiner here. So as we move on here, we see that similar to several other industries, the global housing industry is moving towards a green identity. So again, this is a critical success factor. If you recall from the industry pack, if you have already seen it, if you haven't, take a look after this video. The overall sustainability of prefab housing is very high. It often uses materials that are quite recyclable, renewable, and ultimately you can design a home into much more detail in a factory than you can on site, and this can translate into energy efficiency when the house is running, for example. So there's an increasing drive towards eco-friendly and energy efficient homes, and Jord will need to meet that. If that's what people want, a clever business meets consumer demand. We know this is an industry trend based on the industry pack, but also being presented to us here. So with that in mind, this is again going to be a critical success factor to be eco-friendly and energy efficient as the end product. The prefab house segment of the housing industry has been particularly positive in moving towards these designs, these environmentally friendly designs and development practices, with prefab house designs increasingly focusing on low carbon footprints and energy efficiency. So again, this is a reminder that we are competing to some degree with traditional builders. Usually when you buy a house, you just want a really nice house, right? You just want it to be reliable, sustainable potentially, high quality, looks nice, large, all those things, and maybe low cost as well, or as low a cost as you can expect. Those don't translate well to, oh, I really want to buy a prefab home, or oh no, I will never buy a prefab home, I only want to have traditionally built homes. That's less of a concern for consumers than just the raw facts of what's cheaper, what's the best, what's best for the environment, etc. So we're competing with two different types of company, prefab companies, traditional companies. So we need to exploit these benefits of the prefab process. We need to sort of make sure that we're incorporating the environmentally friendly aspects throughout the process as a company, and increasingly focusing on these footprints and energy efficiency, because that's something that the prefab market clearly has a leg up or benefit over the traditional market. So again, we're disrupting the overall construction process, and we need to make sure that our process exploits all the possible benefits they can. Critical success factor, full stop. That's what we need to take away from this page. Finally, such energy efficient, environmental friendly and high quality built homes are rapidly changing the original down market image of the temporary prefab house of the 20th century. So yes, we saw in the history section of the industry pack that because they were slapdash homes built after the war, lots of people have this image of prefabs equaling low quality. But things like Huff House, a popular German prefab company that are very luxury orientated, they've been on TV in shows like Grand Designs, and that has completely broadened the horizons of the average consumer to how nice prefab homes can be, how luxurious they can look, how energy efficient they are, and how quick they are to build. So again, This is a reminder that consumer trends are moving away from negative connotations and moving more towards a green identity, which prefabs are really well suited to exploit. So again, critical success factors. Apologies for sounding like a broken record, but it is super important that we exploit the benefits of prefab. And this means, in terms of strategy, as Jord, we need to make sure that we don't deviate away from these core values in the pursuit of profit, for example, because it will only end badly. Traditional build homes will become more appealing if we move or lose sight of the key things that prefabrication brings. So, with that said, let's move on to the next page now. And this is going to cover the history of Jord Homes in total. And this will answer some of the questions we have about just how luxurious are Jord Homes, how much do they adhere to these critical success factors, etc. So let's take a look. They were founded in 1966. Okay, sure. And they're in a prosperous country. We know this. Cool. And they're founded by somebody called Carl Larsen, who has massive expertise. Let's make a note of that. And he made use of the abundant natural resources in his local area to create a reputation for the construction of high quality prefab timber framed houses. So two things here: high quality, reputation. So that means that we already have an existing basis for the brand. Jord are going to be known for high quality. This fits our strategy. It's beneficial to our strategy. Secondly, timber framed houses are going to increase fire risk. We learned this in the industry pack, and once again I apologize for referencing it. I'm sure you'll get round to it eventually, but to break it down for you, as you might expect, steel doesn't burn, timber does. And essentially building a house of timber increases the risk of fire, or the spread of fire and the velocity of fire. So where a steel house might just be damaged, a timber frame house might burn to the ground completely. It's about that risk, and I'm sure they have considered it, but it's worth noting that health and safety and how the risk register and risk management plays in is very important here. And next we see that Jord has built over 30 houses by 1970, and then the reputation grew. Okay, so let's move on to this 1980s. So Jord built a factory on semi-rural land owned by the Larsen family, and the facilities for manufacturing, showroom and head office are all currently based on the site. This is quite a nice point to highlight. So no matter what the structure is, and I'm not sure we're going to get a better idea yet, because the contents page didn't have structure on it, if I recall, but this implies that the different branches of the company are all in very close proximity. Now, whilst most things are done on IT systems now, just the close proximity does imply that there will be perhaps less barriers to communication, which can be a downside to different functional structures, etc., that are put in place of a company. So, just as a small point, communication will be less of a problem. Notably, however, we may consider that all on one site means that perhaps there is some efficiencies to be had. Maybe the head office could be moved to a local town and the manufacturing facilities could be expanded into that space. We don't know enough now to make a real sort of speculation about that. However, it's plausible. It's something we could see in the exam, though with this information we can't be sure of it. But just something to keep in mind. The next thing is really, really important, and I'll give you a few seconds to think about it before we talk about it. So, Jord remains a privately owned limited company. Let's stop there for a second. So I'll give you a few seconds as to what that screams at you, and then we'll have a discussion about it. Exactly. So, Jord have the capability of acquiring equity finance from something like an IPO. They could go public. This does have a lot of drawbacks, and that mix in with the different benefits. However, it's definitely possible to be listed and make a big change or big investment into something based on a growth proposition. Project for growth, a huge one I imagine, could result in an IPO, I mean, there's no real hints yet about the possibility of an IPO. Usually you need a big opportunity to think about an IPO. But here we see that there is that scope to do so. And it's important because funding is such a common question. It's a really common question. So we need to be wary of the fact that, we can do it if we need to. Though we do need to remember that there are some drawbacks, such as the cost, different regulations, etc. At this level, we don't need to go into too much depth about that. However, it is an option. Typically, this will come up in a funding question, not a question of should we do an IPO. It'll be more about what should we fund with, and IPO can be part of your answer. I've had to squeeze that one just above because there's very limited space here. But as we move forward, we can see that Jord employ approximately 250 staff, many of whom work at the factory site. That seems quite small. However, Jord also employs teams of expert builders, tradespeople and landscapers. These staff work outside of the factory and are responsible for the completion, essentially, of different stages of assembly and construction. So, with that in mind, these sort of off-site workers are often subcontractors. So they are either small teams that are being employed by Jord on a project-by-project basis, or perhaps a sort of season basis. I don't know. The specifics will be down to, from information in the unseen material. However, we can assume that there are probably 2 to 3 times more staff in that construction phase in general, because the construction phase is something that isn't as impacted by IT and technology than the factory aspects. The factory is where they build all the walls and the panels and the modules. Those are done by machinery a lot of the time. However, these tradespeople, landscapers, expert builders, architects, etc., they will be, more numerous. They might not be full-time staff. So there's many things to consider here. One, Jord are quite large. We're looking at 500 to 1,000 employees at a guess here. And it's important that they've left it out. That's not, an accident. They've left it out intentionally. So I assume we're talking about 1,000-ish employees, maybe a little bit less. And also, some of those tradespeople are not going to be full-time workers, which brings about potential issues in regards to working conditions. Maybe the tradespeople and landscapers aren't happy. They, maybe talk about industrial action, not wanting to continue, go for a different company. All that kind of stuff can come into this. And we did get a warning that HR will be within our remit in the exam. So again, large company, potential issues in regards to different working groups and how they feel about the job, their working conditions, etc. Very important to think about. For example, in the exam, we could have tradespeople not very happy with the fact that they are always working with timber because the fire risk is, too high. That's a bit of an extreme scenario, but essentially worker group has an issue. They are unhappy for whatever reason, and there's some negotiation that has to be done there. And if you remember with negotiation, we're looking at, objectives, how we go about it, a win-win scenario rather than a win-lose scenario. That kind of thing is very important to get a satisfactory outcome. Finally, Carl Larsen, the founder of Jord, no longer works in the business. So this is quite important because older people are more likely to sell their business. They see it as the end of what they can where they can take it, and they are more susceptible to selling it. So I did mention a while ago that large traditional construction companies may want to buy Jord. But if Carl Larsen's son Theo is now CEO, he's obviously a lot younger, he may have more ambition. This then means that, okay, sure, so actually he's not that interested in selling maybe, and he's keen to grow the business in an organic way and maybe do the acquiring themselves rather than be acquired by a large company. So with that in mind, it reduces that possibility. And secondly, we see that 60% of Jord shares are owned by the Larsen family and 40% are by other shareholders. So this brings us to the point that, actually two things I should say. First and foremost, the Larsen family work in the business, and if they sit on the board currently, like numerous amounts of them, if they were to go for an IPO, regulations typically state in regards to governance that you can't have too much interconnection or self-interest between a number of the board members, such as family. It's just not seen as the correct code of governance. And this would be a potential barrier or cost to going public. Secondly, 40% of shares are owned by other institutional shareholders in Corvola, and this means there is a dissenting voice potentially. There could be some conflict between shareholders of the Larsens versus the other shareholders, and essentially this could mean that there are tough decisions to be made. And whilst the Larsen family have the majority and therefore can essentially decide, 40% is a large proportion. So there's a lot of sort of shareholder appeasement that's going to have to be done. And this may become more relevant as we move forward. We'd have to see. Okay, so now we are on to the final page. And this page looks like it's going to have lots of information. But before I get onto it, I did want to mention that typically we do actually a lot more with each page. The problem here is that the context pages are a little bit harder to get genuine exam hints from. They do have them. We've seen them. You know, there's loads there. But we will see more and more as we go forwards. So don't be too discouraged when there are some bits that are a little bit less meaningful, because that's just some of the pages at the start. Usually it gets far more interesting. And this is one of those pages by the looks of it. So we're talking about Jord's competitive advantage. Now, if you think about that, that's inherently linked to our critical success factors that we've already covered at length. You know, I became a broken record for a page. That is, you know, essentially what this relates to. So this is how Jord actually go about it. And essentially they are focusing on sustainability, which, as we saw, is a very wise choice. So from the design process through to the final completion of the interior of each home, Jord focus on minimizing the environmental impact of each house build. So they are really going for that green identity. Yeah, so that CSF of green. And each aspect of manufactured design maximize the economy and efficiency of the house's functionality. So that's relating to energy efficiency. So here we're talking about a long-term vision of how homes can be built in such a way that they are well insulated, they don't lose too much heat, they're minimizing the cost to the consumer, the customer, but also providing the minimal amount of impact from the actual construction process as well. So it's a double whammy. They're really exploiting that benefit of prefabrication by extending it to the point where the life cycle of the home is also environmentally friendly and also very friendly to the wallets of the customer, which is again very, very beneficial and appeals to the demographic that will want to buy their own home. Next up, we see that Jord's leading industry expertise in the combination of glass and its timber frame construction provides a significant difference from prefab house designs, or other ones rather. So this is that differentiation focus under Porter's general strategies, and it's going to be a key source of beating competition, competitive advantage. Interestingly, timber frame and glass is obviously a lot harder than steel and glass based on just the materials involved. Steel was very sort of supportive, timber slightly less so in regards to glass, attaching them slightly more difficult as well, we see in the production process. However, Jord have an expertise that sets them apart by utilising these two very cleverly. They also use triple layered thermal insulating glass designed to maintain heat when it must be kept inside and does not heat up in strong direct sunlight. So it's about keeping the conditions in the home optimal with as much leakage as possible. So that energy efficiency again It's passing cost savings to customers, which is very, very beneficial, but also you will see that the actual components themselves, glass and timber, are a little bit more difficult to manufacture together, and it's got that nice design element, you know, maybe the glass walls with a timber frame. Very, very nice. So with that in mind, again, apologies for sounding repetitive here, but essentially they are further exploiting and really going to town on that luxury branding and ensuring that the prefab process and all those benefits are really, really obvious in a Jord house. So again, we get a mention that the technology maximizes the house heat efficiency and reduces energy consumption. Once again, we see a mention of technology, investment in a new project regarding technology, CAD, CAM, or a different material such as graphene maybe, which we saw in the industry pack. That kind of thing is very, very important to consider, because opportunities for growth might actually be sources of competitive advantage that increase the market share of Jord. This is probably going to come down to technology in many cases, because technology is doing these wonderful things in the prefab market, you know, the way they're built with all the precision, but also, you know, how it is impacting the different energy efficiencies of the homes. We also see that like Amazon, the company Amazon, invested in plant prefab because they themselves were incorporating smart technology and voice activated technology into their prefab homes. So it could be a source of funding in that specific case, but also, you know, technology in general is a key driver of competitive advantage and uniqueness in the market. So again, that is a very important CSF as well. And as we see here, most of the load-bearing components of each house are made of timber. Sure, again, that's the fire risk there, but the important part of timber is that it's a renewable raw material and ecologically sound. So essentially that means that it degrades very well and doesn't have as much impact on the environment as, say, steel, because steel was a man-made sort of alloy. And secondly, it's economically efficient, so it's relatively cheap to manufacture versus something like steel. And that's probably to do with how it's harvested from forests, as opposed to, again, steel being mined in two different components and then merged together. So ultimately, it's about passing those savings to customers, making sure they have an environmentally friendly house, a really long-term vision of how the house behaves in the environment, not only in building, but operation, and then even at the end of the life cycle when it needs to be knocked down. So it's really, really comprehensive, very, very, you know, smart branding here and positioning in the market, because prefabs need to have that leg up on traditional builds because they're the new disruptive force rather than the tried and trusted method of thousands of years. Next up, we see that the wood and glass construction provides a frame similar to a skeleton, and this type of construction therefore allows Jord to offer a high degree of individuality. Each Jord house is unique, since it is possible to arrange the individual elements of the skeleton in an almost indefinite number of ways. So the short version is, Jord are super, super luxurious. They are the creme de la creme. They are looking for these really unique homes, building them for affluent customers, wowing them, making them quite, you know, making it word of mouth worthy. You know when someone tells you about a restaurant and they're like, oh, you really need to try it out. But if you saw an advert for it on TV or on the internet, you'd be far less likely compared to your friend telling you, oh, it's really good. You know, that kind of aspect of marketing is really, really beneficial, and it links to the brand. And Jord are seemingly going for a really, really customizable, unique branding here, really top of the range stuff. So again, it's about that brand positioning, general strategies, differentiation focus. They're really going for that difference here. Once again, it's worth pointing out that Corvola's demographic fit with this kind of branding and positioning. However, will it work in Asia and Latin America? So different opportunities may actually cause Jord to consider a different approach. For example, housing shortages in the UK may happen in Corvola, but housing shortages are not done in a unique basis. A government doesn't want you to build 1,000 unique homes to solve a crisis. They want you to build affordable, sustainable homes, most likely, in as quick a time as possible. They're looking for quality, but they're not looking for unique. They're looking for quality, affordability, mass production to solve a problem. So an opportunity in that regard may cause a sort of, a change, pivot away from this placement. It does seem to me that the industry is moving to a slightly different position than luxury, or at least the demand in the industry is slightly less luxurious than Jord are positioning. So whilst Corvola's affluent population may be quite effective as a customer base, broadening the customer base may be more a case of broadening the strategy to encompass mass production or just more standardized homes rather than this supreme uniqueness that they're going for currently. And as we move down here, we can see that customers value the speed and quality of the process. So again, CSFs rather, that we cannot afford to slack on. Speed in particular relates to worker conditions, like how they feel, motivation, the learning curve, but also the supply chain. Do our third-party suppliers and sort of logistics companies, are they really, really reliable? If so, we may need to renegotiate or find new ones to make sure that the speed is never an issue. It was implied with this sentence that currently everything is fine in regards to speed and quality because the customers value it. However, if it's ever an issue, they will need to sort it out very quickly. And next up, we see that they're all completely pre-manufactured at its Corvola-based factory. So abroad sales will be more heavy on logistics, higher costs for the customer, more potential issues that arise here. So supply chain could mean more factories elsewhere as a new project or a necessity. And following this, we see that they obviously transported and erected on a pre-prepared foundation on the customer site. So again, logistics, supply chain, very important. And the construction on site takes between 5 and 10 days, depending on size and complexity and weather, etc., like a traditional building company would have to factor in. So timing is important. So again, supply chain, as I mentioned, and the overseas aspect is difficult. If they're just in Corvola, the factory, they may need to optimize that with some rebasing or additional factories overseas to meet demand. Now, onto the final paragraph of this video. It's a very, very interesting one from the looks of it. So, in the last decade, Jord has established itself as one of the most exclusive companies in the prefab manufacturing world and has an unrivaled reputation for high quality bespoke homes. Again, we kind of got the gist of this a minute ago about the uniqueness and the extreme individuality of the homes. And many customers are willing to wait up to a year to own a Jord house designed and built exclusively for them. So customers are demanding this product. However, how about expanding that? We're not quite sure about how far that customer base extends to. Can they grow effectively with just this kind of customer? Importantly, the Larson family have always been proud of their long waiting list and considering it appropriately to represent how special their houses are and support the notion of Jord exclusivity. They actually have a policy of maintaining current production levels to continue this rarity. So, for branding, the Larsons have ensured they're not expanding production. Because typically, no matter what, even if you're looking for exclusivity, you still want to increase production so that the waiting list is still present to give the idea of exclusivity, but you want it to be quite a high turnover waiting list because you want to produce more homes and get more revenues. That's just how businesses work. The Larson family clearly are a little bit less focused on profit and more focused on the identity. So that's an interesting interaction. They're sort of artificially slowing down, or at least not slowing down, but like keeping it the same just to make it look exclusive, which is beneficial to a degree, but what about expansion? So that's one of the key points I wanted to make here, is this is very much a case of, if you want to expand, the current strategic approach might not fit, especially with the trends in the industry, where the demand is coming from, and also just in terms of, like, if it's exclusive, then you're not actually building that many, which means you're going to stay quite like a boutique business or a smaller business rather than a large successful business over, that keeps on growing. It's going to stay quite stagnant. Interestingly, the 40% of institutional shareholders are questioning this approach, who have suggested it's time to grow the business. Ooh, this is another red flag from the examiner. This is a huge, huge, huge exam hint. And to be honest, this is what this whole section has been leading up to. We got some hints about it, right? We got some hints about the demand is coming from housing shortages and rising demand from also affluent population. But super luxurious doesn't necessarily mean that lots of middle income people can afford it. When we first read this pre-scene, we thought, okay, they're higher end, but perhaps they're more affordable. Clearly, they're catering to the most affluent middle class and the upper class by looks of it. They're looking for really unique homes, and this is all nice and everything, and keeps Jord looking very, very suave and brand heavy and almost like the Chanel of prefab homes. However, does that actually work for the future of the industry when demand is coming from housing shortages, government contracts, and lots of different projects that probably extend further than housing? How viable is it to maintain this policy of catering to wealthy individuals in wealthy countries on a smaller scale? This is a big question mark, and this brings about shareholder conflict, clearly. And shareholder conflict means that essentially we're going to have this strategic placement question raised in several different ways, potentially. The variance could have a question about how it's beneficial or negative to take on a government contract for 1,000 homes. That's a lot of homes, so you need a lot of change management to sort of transition to a different way of manufacturing, because you can't have 1,000 individual homes with unique features. It's more about uniformity and maybe 3 or 4 designs rather than having one design for each home. It'd be 3 or 4 for the entire 1,000. There'd be about 250 of each type thrown in there. So there is this sort of aspect of the drawbacks of change management versus the benefits of having that big contract and the big cash inflow. So the opportunities are actually mismatching the sources of demand, as I stated, and this is going to bring about that key conflict that is probably going to pervade a lot of the questions we get given in the exam. So this is going to be one of the biggest takeaways from the entire pre-scene. Mark my words, this issue here of opportunities not lining up with the exact current position of the company is going to be either a minor or major impact on so many different areas as we come to go through the pre-scene. And with that specific mention, we're going to make a note right here. So with that said, this is the end of the first video. I hope you found it very useful. We're going to continue obviously in the subsequent videos, going through each page in just as much or more detail. And with that said, compare the notes that you may have made going through this as well with mine. It'll be very beneficial to you to have a comparison. And what I say is not necessarily everything. You could have picked something up in addition, and that's perfectly like the point. That is the point. Lots of different ways to interpret it, and we need to just put it all together into possible exam questions or exam topics. And that's what we're trying to do here. Very clearly, we've got some strategic placement issues, and whether we need to change our generic strategy, such as importers, to, from a differentiation focus to a more broad sort of range of different housing options. So I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much. Hello, it's me again. I just wanted to take a few minutes of your time to first extend my hope that you enjoyed the free sample that you've just viewed, but also to just sort of explain what else a strategy do to help you pass your exam really effectively, provided you found our sample particularly interesting and insightful, of course. So, of course, we have a study text for every module, ranging from P1 to F3, and the certificate level is also free on our website. So we have study texts throughout the CIMA course, every module you could hope to study. The certificate level are free, as I mentioned, and then the rest of them, ranging from P1 to F3, are all available to purchase. Alongside this, if you're not so much a study text kind of student and you prefer a visual way of learning, we have the course videos. We essentially break down the study text into bite-sized presentations with a walkthrough, and it's a very, very, very engaging way of explaining the course. Following this, we have the pre-scene analysis, where we break down each pre-scene sitting into a number of videos, going through the whole document, but also adding a top 10 recommendations for what will come up in the exam, and also a strategic analysis where we put all the models you'd find in E2, for example, to the pre-scene itself, whichever that may be at the time. Alongside this, we provide an industry analysis. This is a document and accompanying video which help you give that contextual information in your exam. So, for example, if the pre-scene's on the oil industry, the industry analysis will break down the oil industry, the current topics, trends, issues, what the competitive market looks like, all those kind of aspects, all condensed into one so you can spend your time wisely in your study period. Following on from this, when you actually want to practice all this knowledge, we have mock exams for all of our materials. So StudyText has a generic mock exam based on the module, whereas the pre-scene analysis has mocks available to purchase that are based on that specific pre-scene, that are targeted to the key issues we believe will come up. And if you're not content with just doing those mock exams and practicing that way, we have a marking and feedback system where you can purchase the ability to send in your paper, have it marked by a CIMA qualified accountant, and get personalized feedback on whether you can improve X or Y area. And sort of finally, if you will, if you're feeling really underprepared and that exam is coming really, really soon, the master classes are offered by Astranti, and they're essentially a crash course in anything you could want for that topic. So if it's a master class on the pre-scene, it's going to give you absolutely everything that you could possibly need to know about the pre-scene in one rather really condensed sitting. Likewise, if it was the F3 masterclass, you would have all of F3 gone through in a very crash course style presentation and video link. You can also purchase it post-stream as opposed to viewing it live, all these kind of aspects. We are very, very confident that these materials will help you get the exam success that you want. So we have a pass guarantee. Provided you fill out a form which demonstrates that you have utilized our materials to a large extent and actually taken the time to study them, and you have unfortunately failed, we will offer you the same materials again for the next sitting as a consolidatory offer to ensure that you can get back on the horse and get that exam grade that you want. With that said, thank you very much for watching the sample video. I hope you enjoyed it and it gives you a lot of confidence in Astranti and your CIMA future.